For attendance, you are required to enter your person and name in the chat window and pass the message in the group. Important discussion how to create the EJB. Steps are involved to create the EJB. Okay, let's begin discussion. Let them chat. Okay, developing your first EJB. Since EJB is similar to the framework, same framework, um, usually what we will do developing any application, most of the time we used the command line interface and sometimes we use the editors, means GUI based editors to compile and execute the Java applications. Now, if it is simple, that is suitable. If it is complex, you need to do lot of things. One time deployment. It's a one time. So most of the time, developer need not to worry because nowadays sophisticated IDEs, NetBean, Eclipse, several other visual code, several other tools, editors supporting to deploy your applications. Otherwise, you need to create the configuration setup file and which are the modules, dependencies, services supported by the application. It will be stored in the configuration setup file, web.xml file, and you need to update the manifest content, the version of the application code, etc. and so on. And finally, you need to create the Java archive file, jar file, and you need to create the enterprise archive EAR. And for the web related pages, you need to create the WAR. So WAR, EAR, and the JAR is a compressed files, compressed class files help to execute your enterprise-wide applications. So that is the manual configuration setup. Now you are understood that the difficulty of managing all the resources in the complex application. So to simplify that, EJB, if by following these steps, you are able to create the and deploy the enterprise application very easily. So EJBs are composed from the following. Any enterprise Java beans, if you want to make use of them, you need to follow the following steps. Here the steps is bean implementation class. See, this bean implementation class can be developed using session bean as well as message driven beans. Depending on the implementation type and the requirement, you need to define the message driven beans, and usually the session beans which will support for all kind of EJB application. Most of the almost all every EJB application needs the session bean, since it will help us to create the sessions. So there are three types of sessions: singleton, one time access of the instance of the bean; stateless, won't maintain the won't maintain the state of the request; stateful, maintains the state of the request, right? So bean implementation class needed. Session bean is one common for almost all the EJP application. The second bean instance is session and message bean, again one, either one of you need to have an instance of it, means implementation class. So for example, when we were discussing the session bean, we have written the calculator, addition, subtraction, multiplication and division. These are all the implementation functionality which will be included in the servlets, right? You have created the corresponding bean and you have created the interface, local interface of that bean. So you, whenever you are going to use the bean in the servlet code, you need to create the bean instance. If it is session bean instance, otherwise if it is message driven bean instance. Step 3, client view. So client wave is the client wave is required for both session and message driven bean. Directly you can't access without the client wave. These. So EJB proxy, that is session beans, servlets are maintained in between to access the bean concepts, and either one of the interface required to create the, depending on the application type which you are deploying. If it is local interface, both server as well as the application present in the same machine or the same environment, so you can deploy the local interfaces. If the client is at remote side, so you need to define the remote implementations. Again, for implementing either one of the interfaces, again you need to have the access of session beans and business interface. So to access business interface, you require to establish a servlet by creating the, by following the step 2, and with the help of the step 2 you are calling the business method, suitable business method which is supported by the bean class file. Then step 7, component interface is needed. Again, you need to have the accessibility of session beans. You cannot directly call, you need to have the bean instance interface, component interface. Then home interface. Home interface is similar to the local. Again, it depends on whether it is the server side or the client side. And step 9, endpoint interface. That is the this interface helps to access the session beans through the local in remote interface. Through that you are required to create the instance of it. Then through the instance you are invoking the corresponding business method. Then finally the message interface, if it is message beans are defined. So we will see this with our program example. You are able to understand it very clearly. Okay, let it be loaded. Now, so EJBs are composed from the following: bean implement, whatever I discussed so far, the step by step, little with snippet code we are going to discuss. Just recall what I discussed in these steps, and the corresponding snippet code and the packages are required to implement those things. So bean implementation class, either session or message driven. Say this bean implementation class written by bean provider. It contains the business logic for a session, or it contains the business logic for message driven bean. So it is annotated with the appropriate bean type. If it is stateless, stateless. If it is stateful, stateful. Otherwise, it is, if it is a message driven bean. So bean implementation, how, what you are defining: stateless, stateful, and message driven bean. Either one of the class you are defining. So if your implementation is stateless, then Add that annotation to the code and define the business methods here. This all needs to declare a stateless session bin. SLSB means stand for stateless session bin. So now we'll look the example of the session bin concept. Still it is opening. Okay. NetBean is visible.
No, sir.
Yeah.
No, sir.
No. Okay. Okay. Now.
Yes, sir.
Yes. Right. Session bin. See, when you create the application of the session bin type, so you need to so when you are creating the Java application, so here it is illustration of session bin. So it selects the corresponding server with the EJB module and that web application module which needs for your application. Okay. So this illustration session bin which will creates the EJB and WAR files. EJB and WAR files. So for every according to the steps, bean implementation class is required, client view is required, and bean instance is required, proxy server is required, local interface is required, business interface. So now we are going to create the client view and the business interface. So client view will be present under the web pages folder of illustration session where. So create the client page HTML. I'm creating the simple client page to accept the name. Input type equal to text, name equal to uh, your name, value equal to null, value equal to null. So it needs a form action, form action equal to the corresponding servlet you need to call. For example, session servlet, the method equal to post, and then include these controls under the form action. Input type equal to submit, value equal to submit, name equal to submit. Then close the form. This is the client view is needed to access the session bean. So run it. So it will display name of the, enter your name as a one control in the browser. Okay, the next step is bean implementation class. So you need to create the session bean. So for that, right click, var file, new session bean, new session bean. So create the session bean, EJP Enterprise Java Bean type, EJB is session bean, new session bean. Here the session type, whether you want to follow the stateless, stateful or singleton, you can implement the corresponding stateless, and the create interface in the steps, step 8, step 5 and 8 and 9 and 10. 5, 7, 8, 9, 10 is the interface creation. Here the interface type either local or remote. Both the server and application is present in the same, as well as client also present in the same server, same location. So you can create the local interface and provide the name of the package. So define the, see the package is PKG. The import, the corresponding package requires is EJB Java x.ejb.stateless, and here new session bean is implementing the local interface. You need to add the business logic. For example, business logic public void display. So you are writing the business logic for this. You are writing the business logic for this. What business logic? Instead of void, I'm using string. String. So return name. Some business logic you define, you need to you are implementing new session bean local interface, you need to expose this business method in the bean interface. The bean interface is this EJB local interface, but there is no methods present. Now just now you added the session bean business logic here. You need to expose this method, expose the method in local business interface. The corresponding abstract is exposed to the new session bean. Say the public string display with parameter is exposed in the local session bean interface. Now you are using that here. You define that display business method here in this class. So you need to override that. Okay, and there is a possibility of exception. You can give the exception if there is no value passing from the client side, possibility of exception. Otherwise leave it, save it. Okay, then so bean class is defined, bean instance we need to add. So where bean instance needs to be added, you need to have a proxy server, EJB proxy server. So for that, create the servlet, source packages, new servlet, source packages, new servlet. Here you can say what is the name given here in the new HTML, session servlet. So create a session servlet. Name of the class name is session servlet. Then add deployment information to deployment descriptor. Then finish. Okay, proxy server you are creating. Now you need to have the interface. You need to have the instance of that interface which you have created as new session bean local. So for that you need to create insert code. Before inserting the code, you are required to add the session bean. You are required to add the session bean new session bean here, insert code, you need to call the corresponding enterprise bean, call enterprise bean. So which enterprise bean just now you created, that is new session bean. Select that the corresponding implementation of that session bean interface is local. Click on OK. So instance of this local interface is defined. The local interface abstract method is this display. This is the business logic implemented in the bean class file here. So to access that, you need to have an interface of that local. Then using that interface, you need to call the business method. Using the interface, you need to call the business method. Out.println your name is you are using the interface instance dot the method display. The parameter is you are passing from the command for passing from the HTML page. So request dot get parameter, the name of the string you defined is your name, and you are passing s1 as a parameter. You are passing s1 as a parameter. That's all. Clear? Now clean and build success. Now run the application. Are you able to visible the browser?
Yes, sir.
No, sir.
Okay. So the client view is single text box with submit button. When you submit this, AJP class is the name. When you submit, that request goes to the proxy server, that is servlet name. Then servlet, with the help of the instance of the interface, it is invoking the business which is implemented under the bean class file, and it maps and it calls the business method, and in that business method you define return statement. The return value is returned to the proxy server present in between, and the browser is going to render the output. Clear? This is the implementation method of either session bean, message driven bean, or entity bean. Understood? Fine. Next. Meeting a little. Meeting. Seminar. Okay. See, just now you are observed EJB stateless, and EJB stateless we have defined. So EJB stateless annotation along with the bean implementation. Okay. Next, bean instance. The EJB container internally contains one or more instances of the bean implementation. That is, example is bean local, new session bean local. That interface instance is created. So you can have multiple inter instances. You have to access the beans. Class to service session or message driven invocation. This is just text with respect to the discussion. These are not exposed to the client directly. You cannot directly access. If you want to access, means there is an interface, means abstract is created between the client and the business implementation. So, but are instead abstracted out by way of the client. Observe here in the code, NetBean code. In the NetBean code, in the proxy server EJB, this display is defined under the session bean. This method is not directly allowed to access like this. So you cannot access like you cannot access that just by calling display out dot println you cannot call display directly like this. It is not allowed. Why? Because display exists with the bean. So here the bean class file creates the abstract between the client. Why it is needed to create the layer? Because EJB is the component based architecture, the same display method can be used by the multiple applications. There, the multiple applications wants to access the one component, that is display. If any one of the application directly accessing means other application, it is not possible to access. So to avoid that, so you need to define the interface. Through interface of your application, you can access the display method. Here one example, display is one example. This method is accessible with the help of the interfaces you cannot directly access. Clear? Then so, because in the client view, clients do not invoke upon bean instances directly. So, this is the contract with which a client will interact with the EJB. So, client is not allowed to access directly. If he is able to access directly, for example, take Airtel, if they allow you to access directly to update your balances, so what happens? So, to avoid such those things, they are implemented the abstractions between the client and business logic accessibility. So by creating the contracts with the help of the contract type of the recharge you made earlier, depending on that they are allowing you to access. In the case of a session bean, the client view will take the form of a business. In the case of session bean, the client will take the form of a business component or endpoint interface. So all to be implemented by the EJB proxy. Here the EJB proxy is the servlet which is interacting with the client forum. So either endpoint interface like your mobile phone or the laptop or any devices at the endpoint. So component and business. So that is the any of the these you can access the session bean through EJB proxy. Message driven beans have no client view. Message driven bean is nothing but was intercommunication between the modules exists within the application. So this won't support the client view. So as they are received as a message events, and entity beans also have no explicit view because the clients will interact with a managed object directly. At least one view must be defined, that is either explicitly or implicitly. Explicitly definition happens through the session beans. The implicitly happens through the either the message driven bean or the entity bean objects. So the EJB proxy, just now we have created the session servlet. It is an acts as a proxy here. Client is requesting for to that proxy, then proxy through with the help of the interface, it is going to call the one of the instances which is defined under the EJP container. Based on the request type, it is going to provide the service. The session bean clients invoke upon the EJB proxy, which adheres to the contract defined by the client view. And upon the EJB deployment, the container binds all appropriate proxy objects into a predefined destination in global JNDI. So Java naming directory interface. What you defined here, when you select when you create the local interface instance. When you create the local interface instance as here new session bean, when you press the dot button, it will all display the predefined methods, business method which is supported by that new session bean interface. It looks which are the methods are defined to call them. Then where a client may look up the reference. If so, select the corresponding business method by the developer. Here client is the developer. From the client's perspective, the proxy is the EJB, though in actually the invocation mechanism is a bit more involved. Here, the proxy acts as a EJB, but actually it is not EJB. It is just a representation of that EJB. But actually, actual implementation happening behind the scene in the EJB module. So local versus remote interfaces. So when referring to a business, home or component interfaces designate the relationship between the process running the client and the Java virtual machine running the EJB container. See here, these home interface or local interface which will define under the client side, and JVM take care of the EJB container. So in the business interface, it is a simplified view introduced in EJP. These defines the business method that are to be supported by session beans. Like what we used here in our example is displays the method that is supported, right? Either you are implementing one of the business interfaces that is local or remote with annotation. Any one interface may not be both local and remote. You need not implement both. Whenever it is required to implement the local, and you can use local, otherwise you can use remote. Through remote access, you can access the EJP beans. Now, component interface. This is the legacy view defined by EJB specification. It has been left in place for backward compatibility with older clients. See, component interface help to access the older software components exist in the EJB container. So older software components are what? What is the newer then first? Newer is today's what you are deploying, that is newer components. Older means last year to last year what I was used, that develop, those are becomes a older component. To access those older component which was supported by EJB 2.3 2.x specification, to access those you need to have the component interface. So it is also known as a local or remote interface contrasted with the business interfaces, which are called business local or business remote. If you want to access such absolute files, absolute not files, application methods, you need to implement Java X EJB object or EJB local object, and will additionally define business methods available to the client. The new just now we define the display method. So suppose in the earlier version again there was a display with display old method. So that definition is different, this definition is different. There is no combined definitions for both, but meant for both, but that use the old display, this is new display. You need to have the logic for the both. It is obtained via the create method of the home interface. You can obtain those methods by implementing. That is just now we use the expose interface, how it has created the abstract method in the local interface. So in the same way you can create the method with the help of those facilities. And home interface, is used to create, find, and remove session bean in references according to the EJB earlier versions, and may define interface extends EJB home or EJB local home, may define methods named with a prefix of create to return component interface references. These home interfaces and all are the EJB 2.x specification. In 3.1 EJB specification, most of these things are replaced. Means most of the things is automated. Means the EJB container itself taking care of implementing and deploying everything. So endpoint interface defines business methods that can be accessed from applications outside the EJB container. This is very important. Endpoint interface, suppose the example of payment gateway like Beam UPI. So Beam UPI is the server exists between your bank account and your phone. So the Beam UPI, what it is going to do, it is uses the web services in between to access your content as well as the bank content, right? Paytm or the Google Pay, all those things, all those business methods. So Paytm or the Beam UPI or Google Pay, these are not a part of Amazon. These are not a part of the Flipkart. These are not the part of any organizations, right? They are independent entities. Still, you are using them to connect your banks, connect your e-shopping malls, right? So external applications, if they need to access your EJB container, you need to build this endpoint interface. This is SOAP architecture, service simple object access protocol. SOAP stands for Simple Object Access Protocol. So you need to implement SOAP. The endpoint interface is based on Java API for XML RPC. So RPC is remote procedure calls and is designed to adhere to the SOAP and WSDL standards, web services definition, language standards. This endpoint interface is a plain Java interface that is annotated as Java X dot JWS dot web service annotation. See, if you want allow you to allow the enterprise application outside the application, you need to implement this endpoint interface. Then message interface. This message driven beans implement the message interface. It is internal communication which defines the methods by which messaging systems such as the Java message service can deliver messages to the bean. Here communicate between the method to method. This is one kind of event type of sending the messages, event messages. So to implement that event kind of the messages, you need to have the JMS services, either queue or topic. An MDB that listens to JMS events would therefore be defined like this. Annotation EJB message driven bean. So activation configuration is a parameter. It is you are passing through this message driven bean, and some implementation of the listener class, listener javax dot jms java messaging service dot message listener. This is the snippet code of implementation of the message driven bean. Okay, is it clear? And in next class we are going to discuss naming conventions, how you need to name actually the methods, class, etc. and so on. Okay, what today we discussed the steps involved in creating your first EJB application, and we have demonstrated that with the help of stateless session bean. Clear? So enter your USN and the Name at the chat window for the attendance. Only two entries are here for presence. Surya, Nayana, Harini, Sridhar, enter your details in the chat window. Okay. If any doubts, you can put in the chat window or you can ask orally. We will discuss with respect to this class. Nayana, did you got that video dependency injection?
No, sir.
Not yet.
No,
I
sir.
was
I was
uploaded.
searching.
Huh?
I searched, sir, but I didn't get it.
Okay. I'll share in the group. Okay.
Okay, sir.
Fine. Okay. Are you able to understanding right EJB concepts?
Yes, sir.
Fine. Okay. See you. We'll meet on Monday, 5th hour. Okay.
Okay, sir.
Fine. Thank you.